What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Warden DPS. So not much has actually changed between Dragonhold and Harrowstorm for Magicka Wardens in terms of rotation. The rotation pretty much remains exactly as you would expect it to be, just still shocks and two abilities. What has changed is the introduction of a new passive for Magicka Wardens. So for Magicka Wardens, we now have 10% additional critical damage for about 4 seconds after we applied Chilled to an enemy. So as a reminder, Chilled is a status effect that is applied when you apply frost damage. When you deal frost damage, the percent chance for it to apply is different for each ability depending on whether it's an AoE or a single target or an enchant. But we did get a small damage buff as a result of this. Now it's a fairly small damage buff. It's only 10% additional crit damage. It's something that Templars and Nightblades already have in their arsenal, but it's still a damage buff nonetheless. That being said, it does not bring Magicka Wardens to the top of the DPS pecking order here, even though the 21 million Parse you will see today is going to be fairly impressive compared to other DPS classes. It is still not going to be one of the better options when it comes to raids, for reasons I'll go into in a little bit here. But moving forward with our build video, we will not be going over any sort of gear like I mentioned in all the other DPS videos thus far. Gear is covered in the Magicka DPS gear video, which will be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in seeing what gear you should be running as a Magicka Warden, feel free to check that video out and then come back here. We will be going over skills and rotation in this video. So let's go ahead and start things off with our front bar here. We have Screaming Cliff Racer. This is just one of 3 possible spambles to run, the other 2 being Force Pulse under the Destro Staff line, or you can also run Elemental Weapon under the Acidic Order line if you have access to that skill tree. However, Screaming Cliff Racer does give us 2% additional damage done from our Advanced Species passive. It also gives us the opportunity to proc off belts as long as we're more than 7 meters away, and it also deals more damage the further away we are. So if you're playing at ranged, Screaming Cliff Racer is going to be the superior option in most scenarios. Next we have Deep Fissure, the kind of core behind our rotation here. Then we have Fissure Infection. Now they did apply Minor Vulnerability as a secondary effect to Fissure Infection last patch. So if you do have a Warden Healer, they won't need to run Fissure Infection any longer because you will be able to cover that for them. Now, I am using Spell Symmetry here for the Parse because Magicka Warden's sustain is still fairly poor, but you should swap this ability out with something else in an actual rate environment. On a 21 dummy, you will not be getting certain sustain buffs, so that's why we're using Spell Symmetry. But in a raid, you will be getting the sustain buffs, so it should be easy, or I should say easier, for you to fully sustain a full light attack rotation. So, in place of Spell Symmetry, you have a couple of options here. Any single dot really works here. You could also run Bird of Prey from the Minor Berserk if you know you're not getting very good Comet Prayer uptime, for example. You can always slot Bird of Prey. This is also affected by the Advanced Species passive, so you will get the 2% additional damage done, and it actually might be in general a pretty decent option because at the very least, if you have Bird of Prey slotted on your front bar, you don't necessarily have to worry so much about losing Minor Berserk uptime if your healer dies or is not able to provide good Comet Prayer uptime, for example. If you want to run just a raw dot though, you do have a few options. The best one is going to be Consuming Soul Trap, but you do have a few others, like for example Degeneration of the Mage's Guild line, which also gives you 2% additional Magicka and Magicka Regen from the Magicka Controller passive, so it could be useful there. So you do have a few options here. Generally speaking, any single target dot is going to be a good option here if you want just raw damage. If you want some survivability, on the other hand, you could run either Morph of Annulment, doesn't really matter which one you choose here, or if you just want like just a burst heal, you can use like Enchanted Growth here on the front bar instead. Then we have Inner Light for the Max Magicka bonus, and of course Eternal Guardian, our bear ultimate, which we will need a double bar. So on our back bar we also have Eternal Guardian slotted. And then we have Winter's Revenge. Unstable Wall of Fire, you can go with the other morph if you want to get yourself a little bit more sustain, but you will see a drop in DPS, so that's Elemental Block 8. Blue Betty for the sustain bonus. We also get a nice purge every 5 seconds if we need that. And we have Barbed Trap for Minor Force. If you are not able to be within melee range to proc Barbed Trap, you can run Channel Acceleration or Race Against Time instead if you have access to the Acidic Order line. Then we have Mystic Orb for the damage. You also get to provide some combustion synergies as well for more sustain for your fellow DPS, but that's not the primary reason why we're running a Mystic Orbs. We're mainly running it for the damage that it happens to deal. So that pretty much covers it here for skills. Now, some of you guys might be asking, well, what if I don't want to run the bear? Well, I'm going to say if you're not intending on running the bear, don't run a Magicka Warden, because not running the bear and a Magicka Warden actually is a pretty big hit to your overall DPS. We're talking like 7, 8k, up to 10k possibly hit in your DPS if you're not running the bear. So I would not recommend not running the bear. Just always run the bear as a Magicka Warden. Your DPS is just heavily reliant on the bear, which is also the reason why our raid DPS isn't going to be quite as good as you see in the rotation and the parse that you're going to see at the end of the video. Because we're so reliant on that bear, our DPS can fluctuate wildly in trials. But a little bit on that before we go over the rotation here. So again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the rotation hasn't changed. It's basically Deep Fissure, 2 abilities, Deep Fissure, 2 abilities. The Magicka Necromancer kind of has a similar thing going on, where it's Blast Bone's 2 abilities within melee range, Blast Bone's 3 abilities when you're outside of melee range. The good thing is Deep Fissure doesn't have that same limitation, so it's always going to be Deep Fissure, 2 abilities. And in terms of what abilities you want to prioritize, basically everything on the back bar you want to prioritize first for various reasons. Wounded Revenge gives you the shield stats effect. As a reminder, we need to proc shield to get 10% additional crit damage, so make sure to have this down at all times. Unstable Wall or Elemental Blockade, going to want that for the VMA bonus. Blue Betty for the sustain bonus. You can drop this a little bit, especially in a raid where you might not need to maintain full uptime on Blue Betty to get the Magicka up. So you could drop this a little bit. But Barbed Trap or whatever your source of Minor Force is, definitely don't drop that. Minor Force is still pretty strong. 10% additional crit damage is definitely a big boost to your DPS. Then Mystic Orb is another one that you can kind of drop a little bit. You can have some downtime. It's just here for the raw damage that it deals. It's one of the strongest dots in the game if you treat it as a dot. So you can drop this, have a little bit of downtime with Mystic Orb if you need to shield up for anything or do mechanics or anything. But again, rotation, very simple. It's just pre-buff with Blue Betty and your source of Minor Force, and then just go to town with your dots, put them all down first. Then it's Deep Fissure and 2 abilities. And yes, your ultimate does count as an ability. So you can use, for example, Bear and then a dot. See here, there's going to be a lot of bar swapping. So if you're on PC, I highly recommend changing your keybind for your bar swap to something that is more easily accessible. The default, I believe, is the tilde key, which is definitely challenging, to say the least, to hit for some people. So I do recommend trying to rebind your bar swap key if you can on PC. For example, I have it as one of my mouse buttons, and it does help out because you will be bar swapping very, very often here as a Magicka Warden. So now we're going to do a 21 minute dummy parse. You guys get an idea of the rotation itself, as well as the kind of DPS a Magicka Warden can pull compared to some other classes here. Now, the 21 million dummy parse is not indicative of where kind of DPS you'll be able to pull in an actual raid environment, particularly for a Magicka Warden. I mentioned this already, but the bear can be a little bit finicky, and you are reliant on the bear for your good DPS. So the bear does have some issues. For starters, it's got to run up to the enemy in order to hit it. So for bosses that are porting around a lot, think something like St. Lothus in Asylum. The bear does move fairly quickly, but it does not teleport. So Lothus teleports around. It's going to take some time for the bear to go from where Lothus was to where Lothus is. And so when that happens, you are losing some DPS with that downtime there. The bear also can't hit certain bosses. Good example of this, the dragons in Sunspire. One of the bear's attacks, Crushing Swipe, which is a pretty big DPS contribution, actually can't hit the dragon at all. It doesn't hit the dragon, it just completely misses. So you're missing DPS there as well. So the fact that you're over-reliant on the bear for good DPS is also what kills you in certain trials. Because the bear is a little bit finicky, because it is a pet, you will have some wild fluctuations in your DPS in trials. So for example, Sunspire, your DPS is going to be much lower than other people's because half of your bear's moves don't hit the dragon. So something to keep in mind as a Magicka Warden. So the 21 million dummy also doesn't give you certain buffs and debuffs that you would have in a raid. Martial Knowledge, Zens, Symphony of Blades for sustain. We are trying to mimic the sustain we're getting in raid by running Ghastly Eyeball, but that is not a complete one-to-one comparison of sustain. So just keep that in mind here. The 21 million dummy parse should not be used as a replacement for a raid parse. It should be used as a point of comparison to other classes in an ideal scenario. So, with all that said and done, let's go ahead and get started here. One last thing before I start here. I am using a weapon damage enchant on the back bar, but there is an argument to be made for using a frozen weapon glyph, or otherwise known as a frost damage glyph on the back bar. I did do a parse with that one earlier, so I will show you the parse with the frost damage glyph, and we can see the comparison between the two. So, let's go ahead and get started. So while I'm parsing, a little bit of rationale behind the frozen weapon back bar damage glyph, the frost damage glyph on the back bar. The rationale behind it is due to the changes to your passive, where you can get 10% additional crit damage when you proc chilled. Is to use the frozen damage glyph so you have more procs of chilled, resulting in higher uptime on the 10% additional crit damage. And while it is a good idea in theory, in practice, and you'll see it at the parse comparisons at the end of the video, it actually ends up not making a huge difference. This parse does seem to be a little bit lower for some reason. Okay, it's coming back up. 21 million dummy is a bit of a long parse, so it does end up evening out any sort of weird inconsistencies with DPS. Though it is still not perfect, you're still kind of at the mercy of RNG gods, even with a longer parse like a 21 million dummy. Here, really straightforward rotation here, even though it looks complicated. If you're able to get the core of the rotation down, it's actually not that bad. And when I say core, I mean the idea that it's just Shulk's then 2 abilities. Once you understand that and master the bar swapping, the Warden rotation I find is actually fairly simple, despite the fact that it can look very complicated from an experienced point of view. See a lot of bar swapping, so I definitely recommend trying to rebind that if you can. This makes your job a lot easier. You don't have to reach for the default key. Actually not sure if we're going to get a higher or a parse around the same as what I pulled earlier when I was trying out different things. We might, but we'll see. It's going to be close. little bit close, but it should be good. Alright, there we go. That is the 21mm Parse for Magicka Warden here. Overall, pretty strong, at least very least in an ideal scenario where the bear doesn't act up at all. 84.7, I pulled a little bit higher earlier, I believe. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. This is the higher Parse that I pulled, 85.6. This is with the weapon damage enchant on the back bar. So closer to 85 is what you should see on a 21mm Parse here. But our mean crit damage here is 115.5. So we did have some downtime on the on that 10% additional crit damage. Go ahead and take a look at the combat log for chilled. You can see there is some gaps here and there in our application. For example, here 16 seconds to about 30 seconds, so 14-second downtime. 4-second application window, so we're looking at 10-second downtime here, for example. Another big jump here would be like here 77.7 to 102.3. That's 25-second downtime between chilled procs, so 21 seconds of downtime on that additional crit damage. But it does even out towards the end, so we do get 115.5 as our mean crit damage. Now, take a look at the frozen weapon parse. We pulled 83.9k here. Again, frozen weapon, so frost damage glyph on the back bar. We have a lot more chilled procs. So we have 91 procs of chilled here compared to only 39 procs. So we're more than doubling our procs for chilled. But our mean crit damage, to say, is still 115.5, and our mean spell damage is just shy of 4,000 compared to 4583. So we're missing a little bit under 600 spell damage by not using the weapon damage glyph. We are getting pretty good DPS out of the frost damage glyph, so you can see here 85 DPS overall. And in terms of chilled, though, take a look at the combat log. We're getting a lot more procs of chilled, as you can imagine, because your enchant can proc chilled, and we're having smaller gaps between them here. So you can see we have a big gap here, 12 to 20 seconds, but that's only 4-second downtime. Everything else is all within, you know, that 4 or 5 second window of each other here. But we still only have a mean crit damage of 115.5 here. So even though we are getting some, in theory, we should be getting better uptime on crit damage. In practice, it's not quite noticeable. I mean, if you assume that we have max and mean, that's still only 0.5% difference, which is not going to make a big difference in our DPS. And we're losing almost 600 spell damage. But even though we are gaining some DPS from the frost damage glyph, we're getting almost 5k DPS. We're losing, combined, we're losing more from missing the 600 spell damage. So you can see here 68.5 compared to 63.8. 12.6 DPS for Deep Fissure compared to 14.2k DPS. So all that combined does end up adding up to more than what the frozen damage glyph is able to provide. So that's why weapon damage is going to be superior. There's also the issue of weapon damage being better for cleave versus frost damage only damages one thing, but those are sort of nitty-gritty details. But that concludes this build video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions at all about the build, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Again, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.